Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this roundtable discussion on science diplomacy. My name is Shelly Kupferberg. I'm a freelance journalist and moderator, and I'm very pleased to discuss with our guests the question of where we currently stand in terms of science diplomacy and what opportunities and limitations it has in times of crisis. This roundtable has been supported by the Krupp Foundation, which has been supporting projects in the field of science since its establishment in 1968. International cooperation and the promotion of research and mobility play an important role in the Foundation's program, and especially German Jewish understanding has always been an important focus for the Foundation. The Foundation sees itself as having a special responsibility in this regard. It bears the name of Alfried Krupp von Bohlen in Halbach, who was convicted in Nuremberg of crimes relating to forced labor and additional charges. Thus, reprisal and educational work, as well as the promotion of scientific cooperation, are an integral part of the Foundation's work. That's why the Foundation has decided to host this roundtable on the topic of opportunities and limits of science diplomacy here at the Falling Walls Science Summit in Berlin. In view of the current situation, the Roundtable on Science Diplomacy will focus also on German-Israeli scientific relations. The Foundation would like to make a visible contribution to the current debate through the panel. Chairwoman of the Board of Trustees has been Professor Dr. Ursula Garter, who's today here. Welcome. We will first exchange some thoughts, experiences, insights, and views on the panel, and then look forward to hearing your questions and comments. So let me briefly introduce our guests today. Professor David Harel, Baruch haba. He comes from Israel, professor of computer science at the Weizmann Institute of Science, and currently the president of the Israeli Academy of Sciences and Humanities and member of Academia Europaea, US National Academy of Sciences, US National Academy of Engineering, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and so on and on. Then we have Angela Liberatore with us. Buongiorno, head of scientific department at the European Research Council, ERC, which manages the evaluations and monitoring of projects submitted to ERC in all scientific domains and undertakes ex ante and ex post analysis of ERC funded research. She previously worked in the research programs on environment and climate, social sciences and humanities, and then international cooperation in the Directorate General of Research. And we have, last but not least, Professor Dr. Robert Schlögl with us. He has been the president of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. Robert Schlögl was the director of the Inorganic Chemistry Department of the Fritz Haber Institute for almost 30 years now. He is a guest professor at the Interface Science Department. Well, welcome everybody, and let's start. I would start with a question for Robert Schlögl. I would first like to ask you for a brief assessment, Mr. Schlögl. Where do we stand today in terms of science diplomacy? What phenomena do you observe? What shifts and alliances? Which countries stand where? Let us briefly sketch a definition of science diplomacy.
There are two in broad lines. Of course, it's diplomacy for science. That means diplomacy has to enable scientific experiments, scientific discussions in foreign countries. The most important thing is, for example, in climate science, where the object of study is, of course, not there where the scientist is, but somewhere else. But when you think also about pharmaceutical studies that you do in the jungle to look for new medicines and all these things, that is science diplomacy that has a very strange connotation, because sometimes scientists come and behave a little bit like old or new colonialists. So they think they know everything, and they go to the poor people there and then discover for them what they have good. The other part of science diplomacy is, of course, really scientists work for diplomatic reasons. That is maybe that what interests us today more.
Right.
And even there we have two avenues to discuss. That means sometimes scientists from a country go out to lobby for what the country does or wants. And in other cases, scientists from foreign countries give information, knowledge, and maybe also opinions or learned opinions about a country and transport this into the decision-making of the country of interest. The Alexander von Humboldt Foundation is active in both these directions because, as you well know, we bring together tandems of excellent scientists in Germany with excellent scientists all over the world. Mm-hmm. And we want to foster the scientific exchange, but as we are doing so, we of course learn a lot about what other countries think about us and what we can send out into other countries, in particular about the very critical issue of freedom of science. And hopefully we will come back to this because freedom of science is a critical issue and that is very close to what diplomacy of science diplomacy will first look for.
Maybe you can just sketch a kind of map to make it more precise. Some cases maybe.
Okay, precision. We have, of course, we in Germany think that we are forerunners of freedom of science, and we want to engage in dialogues, in particular outside of the Western community, how valuable that is. So the elephant in the room is China. Yeah. But of course, Chinese have a very clear view of what science is good for, and that's very different from what we think science is good for. And this debate has been ongoing for at least 2 decades, I think. Whether we are successful in this kind of conviction, I'm not so convinced, because after all, the science is controlled by lots of external forces. We can discuss this. There's funding, for example, a very useful thing. We had very recently here in Germany an incident like this where one tried to mix freedom of science with freedom of funding. The German people know exactly what I'm talking about. But of course, we also have this problem, what I mentioned about colonialism, because in particular, when we think about countries of the global south, then there's a tendency in the West to go there and say, hey, we know what you have to do, and we give you now some money or some opportunity to do some science, but we explain to you how that works. And another very critical...
It's a matter of power. Right?
Yeah. That I want to mention is, of course, freedom of science and the right of knowledge. So, for example, distribution and dissemination of knowledge has a lot of economic issues with it. So, talking about publication and open access and all these things. And also that is a very big barrier for a global free exchange of information, which is a basis of empowerment. And that is something that we also should keep in mind.
Okay, thank you very much. We will get back to the case of China a bit later on. Angela, under what conditions can scientific cooperation with a foreign country be maintained during times of crisis, for instance? What dynamics need to be taken into particular consideration today? What has changed and shifted in recent years and why? Many questions,
just
I admit.
For a short answer. Thank you, Shelly. Thank you, Robert. Actually, I think I could complement, to answer your question, Shelly, something that Robert said about definitions, and say that one important aspect of science diplomacy is also that it's most needed when the situation is most difficult, right? We don't need diplomacy to speak with our friends and when everything is fine. So, but why science diplomacy? Well, for 2 reasons. One is that international cooperation is part of the DNA of science. We need circulation of ideas. We also need some circulation of the people carrying the ideas. And if this is hampered, we need to do something about that. Diplomacy needs science because science is power. It's not only about the so-called critical technologies now, it is about everything we do in our life. But today, the pace of science and technology is so fast that no international affairs can be addressed without the contribution of science and technology. There is another element. Who is doing it? Well, you need the scientists to do it, of course. This is what I call diplomacy bottom-up, and this is a practice that has been going ahead for centuries, before the definitions that you were contributing of the AAAS and Royal Society report. And of course, top-down, meaning governments and large institutions to engage in cooperation in science with each other, also as a mean of keeping spaces for cooperation. I'm wearing this jacket in honor of one of, I think, very important, especially these days, I would say, example of science diplomacy through a large scientific infrastructure. This is called Sesame. It's the called synchrotron of the Middle East.
Jordan.
It's in Jordan, and this is why I'm wearing this jacket from Jordan. Members include Iran, Israel, Palestine, Egypt, the European Union, and some of its member states, including Germany, are observers. The idea comes from here, somebody says. Anyhow, it surely comes from CERN, which, as you know, has been an important project for peace in science after the war, and one of the areas of continued scientific cooperation across the walls during the Cold War. So these are, I think, important examples and concepts. Yeah. And I will just anticipate, but we'll discuss it later. We are working right now on a European framework for science diplomacy. This is something we started at the time of Commissioner Moedas, but it requires more strengths and strategic thinking. The panel before on breakthrough science was mentioning the fact that we are too fragmented in Europe to have an impact. And one of the reasons for this report is to try to enhance the impact of European science diplomacy by working on it together.
And how it looks like we will talk about later. That was the red carpet for you, David Harel, actually talking about the Middle East. There are repeated efforts, including from academia, to boycott Israeli academic institutions. What is your current experience of the situation? What are the specific effects of these developments, and how do you still try to maintain cooperation and exchange right now?
Well, so my ticket here is to talk about Israel and the boycotts. I will do that. But
would be great.
But I can't help tagging along what was said here about governments. So look how interesting. Let's take the United States, Germany, and Israel. The United States just had an election. We know a little bit about what the new administration thinks of science. Germany will have an election. I think I have a feeling that it'll be somewhat better in terms of government versus science. In Israel, we have no idea whether we will have an election, whether certain parties will be banned by law, whether the election will be twisted. We have no idea. So this is, to me, this is interesting in terms of government versus science. And as you both said, the relationship between government and large corporation and science is very, very, very important. In terms of what we are going through, so you wear a Jordan jacket, I'm wearing two symbols to remind me every morning when I look in the mirror of the 101 hostages, but it reminds me of the situation in general. I'll get to the boycotts in 1 minute.
That's okay.
I just want to mention that, so I'm here on behalf, I think it says both of the Weizmann Institute, but also president of our academy, and our academy was founded by law, and one of the main roles that I am tasked with by law is to advise our government and our government branches on anything to do with science, science policy, planning for the future, and so on, where science includes humanities and education, and in my book also values. It's a very broad definition. And so I just want to share with you my personal daily dilemma. I wake up in the morning. On the one hand, I have to help our government, I have to advise it, I have to form committees, a lot of stuff that has to be done in terms of that. On the other hand, I'm a very, very vocal activist against what our government is doing right now. Not everything, but many things.
Education. There's many academics and also institutions.
But it's
actually
not only the war in Gaza and the people hurt in Gaza and the hostages, and it's also what has to do with scientific and educational institutions in Israel. We have an education minister who I will say here in front of everyone, I'm truly ashamed of him.
Yeah.
I spent 2 hours the other day with the German counterpart, Bettina Stock-Reitzinger, and the comparison, begs to be made. Now, we are undergoing problems. You mentioned boycotts. There are also rallies on campuses. The rallies, by the way, I identify 3 narratives that you hear on campuses in Europe and of course in the United States. And I'll give you them very, very briefly and tell you what I think of them. The first narrative that you do hear is anti-Semitism. Let's get rid of the Jews. We don't want to see them anymore. The second narrative is anti-Israelism or anti-Zionism, which is almost the same. Let's get rid of the state of Israel. We don't want to see it anymore. I will stand on the podium, jumping up and down, go anywhere needed to fight against these 2 narratives. Anti-Semitism is a no-no. Anti-Israelism is a no-no. But the third narrative is anti-what Israel, or many of the things that the Israeli government is now doing, and so we want to get rid of the Israeli government. And I will equal zest, maybe even more, will stand on the table, on the podium, jump up and down, and fight for getting rid of our government. And I don't say this as a professor at Weizmann or as president of our academy. I say this as a private citizen. The boycotts also can be divided into 3 kinds very briefly. There are personal boycotts. We see a lot of those. You know, I'm invited to a conference, then I get an email a couple of months later saying, you know, maybe you shouldn't really come. It might not be comfortable and so on. There are many cases like that. People who collaborated with a collaboration researcher for years, suddenly she gets a message saying, no, I can't collaborate with you anymore because A, B, and C. And then there are institutional boycotts. There are universities, not 1, not 2, who have made decisions not to stop usually, but we ask our professors to reassess your relationships with Israeli researchers. And in 1 or 1.5 cases, there is almost a countrywide attempt at this. You know, the organization of rectors of universities in country X has decided to instruct their people to reassess, reevaluate, and so on. So these are 3 kinds of boycotts. We will probably talk about this more, and I've already spoken quite a bit. I just want to say that the statement that one has to make, and this has been hinted at here earlier, about that is science is borderless. Thanks for being at Sesame. CERN and ESRF are scientific organizations that were founded and among other things, they prove that science is borderless. It has to be borderless. I don't want people to collaborate with me.
Crises like the Cold War
or
something.
I don't need people to collaborate with me because I'm a great scientist or they're a great scientist and I'm not. I need us to collaborate because that's how science works. Yep. And in the hard science, the natural and exact sciences, that is obvious. In the humanities, it maybe is not so obvious, but it's also equally important because you get values coming out of it. You get humanity, you get liberal issues that have to be shared worldwide. Just to finish this, I love to give the example of Ada Yonat, who is a chemist in our institute at Weizmann, Nobel Prize laureate in chemistry. She deciphered the structure of the ribosome. She did not do this in her Weizmann laboratory on her own or in her attic. She did this in collaboration internationally. A lot of it was in Hamburg, by the way. She did not do this with her parents' money or with her own money. She did this with international money, I think ERC grants also, but definitely EU money. And not only is her work international, but the results of her work are not going to be good only for, I don't know, Israeli hospitals. They are going to be good for everyone. Yep. And so that is an example of why science has to be borderless. Collaboration is crucial. I think you said that in as many words, and we have to fight for that.
But let's look where maybe limits could be. Robert Schlögl, as a member of the Leopoldina, the chemistry section, who coordinates the Academy project Energy Systems of the Future. Let's talk about China maybe again. The Chinese Academy of Sciences recently celebrated the 50 years anniversary of its cooperation and networking in Berlin, here, together with the Max Planck Society and Leopoldina and CAS also recently jointly organized the second Science of Future conference in Berlin. So how well do these collaborations work, and where do things get maybe difficult?
I think I can easily follow what you just said. In particular, our collaboration with China is driven by the necessity to collaborate with China on issues of climate and energy. It is the largest part of the world. So If they do not do what is necessary for climate protection, then nobody else is useless. So it is very obvious that is important. And this is equally important because many climatic phenomena of the global north happen on the territory of China. So even if you want to study that, you have to be there. And that was the reason why also our Leopoldina decided that it is crucial for the issue of climate and energy to collaborate with them and just open this one door and say, we might differ on many different issues, but certainly not on the necessity to do something there together. And we have a vivid exchange on technologies and also, as you said, on scientific data. I can very strongly underline what you said. Scientific results are for the whole humanity, and they are not for a country, not for a company, and certainly not for an individual. And so it is absolutely necessary to do so. We understand very well that this is a difficult issue to collaborate with a country. And with Bettina Stark-Watzinger, I have a vivid dialogue on this issue of security of research. But it is simply necessary to have a global exchange. And China is the global partner at the moment, at least in these issues, but also in nanotechnology is the same. And there you would say you can't just do without China. The political issues we tend to avoid. That is something which is difficult because then you come into also moral issues. Do you talk to people about such issues? In private conversations, that is fine. We certainly do that. But when you do this officially, then one sees the end of science diplomacy, because if the Chinese officials would just interrupt the collaboration, then this would be a harm to everyone. And for that reason, one has to be very careful.
And also the scientists could get into difficulties.
No? It begins with individuals, because, as you rightly all said, science is always done by individuals, not by organizations. And so the person-to-person contact is very critical. And if, for example, a government interferes with these personal relations, that is very tricky and potentially dangerous. But on the other hand, it is also necessary to recognize that the system of China is simply different than our Western system. And we can talk as much as you want about this. This is simply different. And we do not have the force and the empowerment to say, you have to follow us. There is no basis for that. So one has to find this, what is diplomacy called. You have to talk about this. You have tried to be open that at least a dialogue is possible. That is the maximum that I can hope.
So let's get back to other projects within the European Union. Angela, can you give us a few examples of what forums exist to develop standards and guidelines for science diplomacy?
Well, I would not call them standards, because in the European Union, standardization is a very important regulatory aspect. But we are indeed working on a report to develop a framework for European science diplomacy, trying to join forces and making it more effective and overcome the fragmentation. So it's actually a co-production of many people. I'm just one of many of them. It is coordinated by the European Commission together with our colleagues in the European External Action Service. We had working groups with 130 people, including scientists, diplomats, and what we call intermediaries, organizations linking scientists and politics and diplomacy more particularly. And we are focusing on how to build capacity and training for science diplomacy. How do scientists learn better how to interact with diplomats? How do diplomats learn better to integrate science and scientists in their cooperation? And how can intermediary organization providing scientific advice for policy, foresight, and so on help all this work? Another one is about how to ensure that once this capacity is there, we have the capacity in the European Union delegations, in the member states' embassy, really to carry on science diplomacy with science counselors and more. And more strategically, how do we deploy science diplomacy in an effective and strategic way to support foreign policy on one hand, but also support European science policy on the other, because a lot of it is indeed about how Europe deals with cooperation also with countries outside Europe. We have countries associated to the framework program of research, and we have other countries we cooperate with. So it's
Sorry,
very
let me just ask, is Israel included in this programs?
Yes. So Israel is
Thank
one
you.
of the countries.
Well,
is one of the countries associated to the European Framework Program, along with all the countries of the European neighborhood, East and South. Ukraine became associated to the Framework Program of Research as well as a special situation, obviously. And the special situation, for example, is that given the war in Ukraine, they do not contribute to the budget, while the other countries need to contribute to the budget of the European Framework Program in order to be associated to it. And we have other countries with whom we have international cooperation agreements, including the US and others. Now, of course, as we said, diplomacy is especially important with the people who are not obviously your friend or like-minded. Now, who is like-minded or not can change very quickly.
that's true.
Right? So this is also why it's always wise to try to keep some bridges of cooperation between the scientists to ensure that evidence-based reasoning, data and analysis, ways of detecting early signals, early warning and so on are available for people in politics and for the broader society, and also in terms of the cultural aspects of science and critical thinking being part of our culture. And here is also where the point about freedom of science and academic freedom, which is in the European Union provided in Article 13 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, so we take it very seriously, are part of the baggage. You mentioned China, and just to go with some names, straightforward, in the European Union, we say about de-risking but not decoupling. What does it mean? So de-risking is normally meant we should have, of course, cooperation with China. Sometimes I hear people saying we have to exclude China, and I say, look at the map of the world. We exclude China, or would they exclude us? And looking at the
That's the real issue, actually.
Voila, science and technology developments and powerhouse. This is not exactly very strong reasoning. But the risk means be careful on how we do the cooperation with China. For example, it means be warned about the so-called seven sons, meaning the universities which are directly connected with the military
state
apparatus and state. But please go ahead with other things. And this is not decouple, but keep the engagement. I mentioned Ukraine, of course, is our not only duty, but strong interest to have a strong Ukraine and to overcome the conflict. So we have a lot of instruments to collaborate with our Ukrainian colleagues in ERC. We also launched recently a mentoring initiative because our Ukrainian colleagues and friends who are working very much about science and research during the war, knowing this is the future for post-war reconstruction, is help us at home. We don't want only you to help people who needed to flee the war, which is also an important duty, support researchers, refugee researchers and researchers at risk. We need help at home to avoid brain drain. So this is, for example, what this mentoring scheme is doing. Of course, we have an issue which relates to sanctions to Russia. Those are, of course, about people in the list of sanctions and institutions, which makes a lot of sense. Having said that, what about the young students and those researchers in Russia who are not friends of Putin, but also don't want or cannot leave Russia? We also need to help those. And we need to keep some people-to-people individual contacts so that the institutional side is taken care of with sanction because of the war, but some spaces to keep the brain and the circulation of ideas going, and also not forget an old generation of young scientists. Keep going. Yep. And of course, for Israel, yes, it's associated to the framework program. We get requests in the European Commission and the European Union more generally is this okay with the things which are happening? So we remind people that as part of the association, it's clear, David knows that extremely well, that the European Union cannot fund any activity or Israeli entity in the occupied Palestinian territories, West Bank and Gaza.
That's a red line.
This is a red line.
Okay.
It's part of international law. It has always been there.
Yeah.
And also, there is a debate on dual use later on. I will be very interested. In the European Framework Programme of Research, we know if you develop an equation or an algorithm, you don't know whether this might one day have dual-use applications. So what we say is that we know, it's not that we are forbidding dual use, because we don't even know when this will be the case, but we do not pay for military applications. So to the people who tell us, you know, is this something that can help, for example, the military in Israel, we can say no, because we cannot pay military applications.
So let's get back directly to Israel, David. I know you took some notes, but maybe you can add which forums currently exist for further exchange for Israel, actually.
Which forums in Israel?
Yeah.
Oh, lots, and we're open. Even Ukraine, our academy, which has a very small budget, we were able to fund some money for Ukrainian professors to come to Israel for a few months, and we also funded, I think, 15 or 20 Russian scientists who were able to leave but were against Putin to come to Israel. This was with a very small budget. We're open to everything. I know very well about Israel being part of the EU scientific programs. I myself got an ERC grant in the first round. Even I managed to get an ERC grant in the first round, and I've just submitted another one. And by the way, you made a very, very important comment. One of the things I had to look at very carefully when submitting, this was 3 or 4 weeks ago, they said, can your work be used for military applications? I do something like algorithms. It's languages for software and system development. Of course, you can take those languages and build whatever you want with them. So we consulted because we also have to be very careful, and I signed this. In terms of China, yes, you both mentioned this. There's always a little dilemma there. I happen to be, and I can help you if you need a member of the Chinese Academy, if you need a spy inside the system. But that was a joke. But there is yes, you were too. So there is a little dilemma there that I have, because people back home, sometimes even friends and family, they say, how can you be even connected by being elected to the academy with China? You know, they do these and these terrible things, and I give an example. Answers similar to the ones you gave. It's big in science. You have to be careful not to work with people from the military universities, but that works okay. I have something more to say, but maybe later. So.
Okay, maybe later, because it's up to you right now. Do we have any questions? I see some hands here. So do we have a microphone? So yeah, there was this lady next to the camera, actually first. Please go ahead.
So thanks a lot for your comments and open conversation. You mentioned about Sezami as a person coming from Iran and physics background. I can really say that with the totalitarian regimes, it's really, really complicated, because the regime does not even allow the scientists from Iran to go to the meetings and having the collaborative publications. So when people mentioning Sezami as a really successful science, diplomacy for science project, I say that I'm sorry, I'm coming from Iran and I know that the colleagues are really struggling for this project. So let me just ask you a question. How we can really deal in the case of the science diplomacy with totalitarian regimes? Because as you mentioned, for example, the scientists in Russia also facing really severe suppression, because we know that there is no democracy there. And it's also the case in my country as well. So many scientists, they don't have the academic freedom as well. So they really do political acts, but of course there is no support for them in general. So I'm just wondering that how we can really deal all the scientists with the same view, that they just want to do the science and they were just born in a really wrong place, maybe wrong time, that they cannot really do the job that they want to do and pay a really harsh price for what they want to do. And we have a really great support for Ukrainian scientists with many, many programs like Philip Schwartz initiative with von Humboldt Foundation. But unfortunately, this is not the case from the scientists coming from Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, Libya, and all these places that they have a conflict. So I just wanted to emphasize that. Can we have any protocols to protect science and scientists before the crisis and the conflicts happen?
Thank you so much. Do you want someone directly to answer
Any
it?
of them
or?
would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, but of course, scientific freedom is a very strong and important issue connected to scientific diplomacy. So, who wants to answer?
I can
Angela.
start since
And
I
then
mentioned
Kupferberg.
sesame. Yes, first of all, having something like sesame can be used as a catalyst to insist that Iranian scientists participate, since the government is part of the members.
And does
So
it
if
work
you like,
practically?
that the point is the catalyst, but to make it work is definitely not easy. Now, as mentioned earlier, there are, if you like, two scenarios. One is, as you said, about protecting scientists. For example, the scientists who flee countries, and for this, Scholars at Risk, CARA, and other organizations have been doing wonderful work. And for those of you who do not know the Free to Think report of Scholars at Risk, please do. Scholars, researchers, students are attacked during war and by authoritarian regimes, jails, torture, and all the rest. And it's increasingly so. So we normally hear about doctors, humanitarians, journalists being attacked, but it's also for students and researchers. So there are those organizations, and in the European Union we also have a program that started actually with the war in Syria to welcome and protect, refugee scientists. At home, obviously, the matter is more difficult. As I mentioned, for example, for Russia, how do you keep some people-to-people cooperation in a way that doesn't become dangerous for them? So it's probably easier in some fields of natural sciences and engineering, for example, than in social sciences and humanities, where some areas of research are simply banned, right? While if you deal with particle physics, maybe, or sequencing of DNA, that's a bit easier, not always. And the point is, people to people, people who know each other, who can trust each other, who get some support by the diplomats to have, if you like, these corridors of cooperation, so that this becomes one of the elements, hopefully, for people to know there is support, and in addition to that, also get some tools to get the science going and be with others.
Thank you so much, Angela. Another question here and here and here. Let's try to have them all.
From everything you've described about science diplomacy, it seems to operate at the very highest levels of government and intergovernmental relations. Can you identify any ways that younger scientists or younger civic leaders can get involved on the ground with efforts towards science diplomacy?
Thank you for the question. Who wants to answer? David?
Well, yes, I think both Germany and Israel have young academies. They're both, I know a little bit about the Young Academy in Germany, and I know a little bit more about they're doing extreme efforts in connection with government, not only the old academy, also the Young Academy. There's some brilliant people there, and they sometimes make me dizzy. They have a lot of ideas and do things, and there's a lot of work going on there. One thing that I made a note of, which has not been mentioned before, which we must fight, and I think the younger generation can do even a better job than the older, is fighting against fake science and fake news and science denial. Mm-hmm. I have this little hobby of collecting anecdotes from where people tell me, so someone said to me a while ago, global warming, that's not a problem. All you have to do is put an air conditioner in every room. And people say, so people who don't get vaccinated, one of them once said to me, I'm not getting vaccinated because, and I said, why? He said, well, I can show you examples of someone who got vaccinated and this and this and this and that terrible things happened to them. So I said, okay, why do you cross the street? He said, what do you mean? I said, I can show you examples of people who cross the street and this and that terrible things happen to them. And he said, that's different. No, listen. And he said, that's different. And I said, yes, it is different. And one of the reasons it's different is because the probabilities are different. And then he said the following sentence, and with that, the conversation ended. He said, oh, you scientists and your numbers. And that was the end of the conversation. And this is not only in the sciences, in humanities too. Yeah. Someone once said to me, the French Revolution, that's when Lionel Messi moved from Barcelona to Paris Saint-Germain. You know, this is ignorance. So we have fake, we have denial, and we have ignorance. Our finance minister, still finance minister, on record said that the theory of evolution is a farce, or is passé, I forget which word he used. And this is the person who, among other things, is responsible for funding science and research in Israel. That's someone I have to fight. The younger people, they, I think, are better in doing this, and our young academy are making important efforts in that direction.
Let me just add, a professor from the US told me, an historian, he asked his students who was Lenin, and the answer was one of the Beatles. So that goes maybe with those kind of anecdotes. Thank you. So there were some hands, please. Or here. Let's start here and then go there.
Hi, I'm a PhD student in particle physics, and one of my experiments is actually an experiment in China. So that part of discussion was really relevant to me. And so after the events with the Russian invasion, a lot of collaborations just suddenly disallowed students, PhD student researchers to use the results to cooperate with researchers in Russia. And also for us in particle physics, we have large collaboration, we have very expensive equipment, so we need to collaborate. And now I want to ask you, what would you advise young researchers who are not established yet? Because just cutting contact with experiments, collaborations for us could mean not being able to finish our PhDs, not to be able to apply for grants simply because we don't have our research. And what would you advise politicians to help support the younger researchers who just don't have the net to fall back on?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Robert.
That's a good one for me. So first I would advise all the younger scientists to vividly continue their work, because we definitely need all your results and the efforts. What you can and what you should do is involve yourself in these dialogues about science, security and things. That is, you can get involved, and you mentioned the academy. Also the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation itself has a lot of instruments to bring this knowledge from younger people into the political circles. That is part of our mission. And stand up for it. We will certainly give you support. So me personally, but also certainly the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation follows exactly your lines. When you think about the life of Alexander von Humboldt, he would be shocked by a discussion that we have today about the academic freedom. That is impossible. But do not give in about this, because in most cases, and I recognize this idea to shut down collaborations internationally on high levels simply comes from the ignorance about the consequences. And against ignorance, you can do something. You can instruct people.
So his short answer is call Robert.
Will do.
That was too short.
Thank you. One last question from the audience, I think here. This gentleman received the microphone.
Well, actually, I'm working since more than 50 years at CERN. And CERN is the first European organization to which Germany became a member without any restrictions in 1954, before the European Union, sorry. And Israel is, of course, a member state since 2000 and some. Now, CERN was founded in the wake of the Manhattan Project, a military project, which involved a lot of fundamental science. And it was made in order to have fundamental science become alive again in Europe. And it has success. I think it's undoubtedly a successful institute. Now, we have had, during the Cold War, the tradition that at CERN, scientists from China, from Russia, from the US, from Europe could discuss freely without any problem, not supervised. The supervisors, we knew how to keep them apart. At the change of the falling walls, the first institute of the German Democratic Republic to become a common German institute was the institute in Zeuthen, the Particle Physics Institute in Zeuthen. And of course, we had organized immediately in 1990 the review which was necessary, an international review which made that institute a part of DESI. in Hamburg, of the Helmholtz Corporation. Now, we face now the problem, and that I really join with the former speaker. Our member states tell us now we should sever our contacts and our projects with the Russian Federation. I think this is short-sighted, and this is wrong. Because at the change in 1991, I got invited by a Russian institute, Azamas 16, to have a discussion with these people what they should do in science, how they should become scientists like the other scientists, the fundamental scientists in the West. Because we had the connections, we had the people, we had the discussions. Really, on the level of people, it is wrong to cut the ties we have.
Thank
and
you.
We should really not do that.
Thank you for your
And their
point and the strong remark. We have to close the panel within a minute, so thank you and sorry for interrupting. Finally, in the end, let's come back to the title of this summit, Falling Walls. I ask you all for a short answer, just a sentence. How do we manage to tear down the wall in science diplomacy to allow science transfer to circulate fairly and constructively worldwide? Just one sentence from each one. Who wants to start? Without too many comma.
I try one sentence.
Okay. Robert Schlögl.
Support individual collaboration, full stop.
Thank you. Angela, with the microphone.
Diplomats and people in policy help the scientists to keep those collaboration going.
Thank you so much.
And mine is a collaboration between both of these. Work hard to convince decision makers to take science seriously for the long-term future and the collaboration between countries.
Thank you so much for this panel. David Harel, Angela Liberatore, Robert Schlögl. Have a good day. Stay healthy. Thanks for coming and your interest. Bye-bye.